The night Rodney Dangerfield walked onto Johnny Carson's stage and said something so devastating, so brutally honest, that Johnny Carson stopped the entire show. The audience laughed at first. Then they went completely silent, because what Rodney revealed wasn't a punchline. It was a confession. A 60-year-old secret about the man behind the jokes. The man who told the world he got no respect, and actually meant every single word. What did Johnny Carson do when he realized Rodney wasn't performing anymore? What secret had Rodney Dangerfield been hiding behind every laugh for 6 decades? And why did Johnny Carson say this was the one interview he never wanted to end? Stay right here, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the funniest man in the room. I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you didn't subscribe. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's the free thing that anybody that watches this show frequently can do to help us here to keep everything going in this show in the trajectory it's on. So please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way you are part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. The night nobody expected the truth. March 4th, 1983, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was 40 minutes from taping. Backstage, the green room smelled like cigarette smoke and hairspray. Makeup artists darted between rooms, stage managers barked into headsets, and somewhere in the controlled chaos of one of the most powerful studios in American television, a 61-year-old man with a red tie and a face built for suffering sat completely alone. Rodney Dangerfield. He was tugging at his collar. He always tugged at his collar. It was his signature move, the gesture that had made him one of the most recognizable comedians on the planet. America loved that collar. America laughed every time he grabbed it. It meant a punchline was coming. It meant relief was on the way. But tonight the collar tugging wasn't for the audience. A production assistant knocked gently on the green room door. "Mr. Dangerfield, 15 minutes. Rodney looked up, and the assistant later told colleagues she almost didn't recognize him. Not because he looked different, because he looked real. The performance wasn't on yet. And what she saw underneath it, before the jokes and the gestures and the self-deprecating thunder, was something she hadn't expected. She saw a man who was exhausted from a lifetime of pretending. But what nobody in that building knew, not the producers, not Ed McMahon, not even Johnny Carson himself, was that Rodney Dangerfield had arrived at NBC Studios that night, carrying something heavier than his act. He had arrived carrying a decision he had been wrestling with for years, decades even, and had never once acted on. Tonight he was going to tell Johnny Carson the truth. Not the punchline version of the truth, not the crowd-pleasing, collar-tugging, self-roasting truth that packed comedy clubs and sold out Las Vegas showrooms. The real truth. The truth about where all those jokes actually came from. The truth about a little boy in a cold apartment in Queens, New York, who learned at 6 years old that if you made people laugh fast enough, they didn't have time to hurt you. And what happened when Rodney finally said those words out loud, on live television in front of millions of Americans, would become one of the most quietly devastating moments in the history of The Tonight Show. But to understand why that night mattered so much, you first need to understand who Rodney Dangerfield really was. Not the character, not the legend, the man, the boy nobody saw. His name wasn't Rodney Dangerfield, not originally. He was born Jacob Cohen on November 22, 1921, in Deer Park, New York. His father, a vaudeville performer named Phil Roy, left when Jacob was 2 years old, just left, packed up whatever performers pack, and disappeared into the world of cheap theaters and cheaper hotels, leaving behind a wife, a daughter, and a toddler who would spend the next 60 years trying to make sense of that absence. His mother was not a warm woman. She was not built for softness. She kept the lights on, and she made it clear, not through cruelty, but through a particular kind of emotional distance that can be just as devastating. That Jacob was not the priority, that he was present, but not particularly wanted, that he existed in the household the way furniture exists, useful when needed, ignored the rest of the time. Jacob Cohen grew up in Kew Gardens, Queens, during the Depression. There was no money, there was no affection, there was school, which he was good at, and there was silence at home, which he was desperate to fill. He discovered comedy at 9 years old, not on a stage, in a school cafeteria. He said something, he could never remember exactly what, and a table full of kids laughed, really laughed, The kind of laugh that fills a room and bounces off the walls and makes the person who caused it feel for just a moment like they exist in a way that matters. Jacob Cohen had never felt that before. He chased that feeling for the rest of his life. By 15, he was writing jokes and performing at small venues in Queens, barely making anything, but unwilling to stop. He quit school at 17. By his early 20s, he was working the Catskill circuit under a different name, grinding through clubs that smelled like cigarettes and ambition, developing the act that would one day make him famous. But here is the part nobody talked about, the part that Rodney Dangerfield kept hidden under 60 years of punchlines. He quit. He actually quit. In the early 1940s, Jacob Cohen, not yet Rodney Dangerfield, walked away from comedy entirely. He decided he wasn't good enough. He decided the world had confirmed what his childhood had already suggested, that he didn't have what it took. He got married, had 2 children, and spent the better part of a decade selling paint and aluminum siding in New Jersey, trying to be a regular man with a regular life. And it nearly killed him. Not literally, but something inside him, that cafeteria laugh, that first electric moment of being seen, refused to stay buried. By his late 30s, he was back, performing again, reinvented as Rodney Dangerfield, with a new name, a new act, and a new signature line that had crystallized from the raw material of his entire life. I don't get no respect. He wasn't writing a character. He was writing his autobiography. What Johnny Carson knew. Johnny Carson had been watching Rodney Dangerfield for years before that March night in 1983. He'd seen him perform in clubs. He'd had him on The Tonight Show before, many times in fact. And each appearance had been the same glorious, reliable explosion. Rodney would walk out in that slightly too tight suit, tie already askew, collar already being grabbed, and within 90 seconds the studio would be in chaos, pure uncontrollable laughter. The kind that leaves your stomach sore. Johnny loved having him on. Every producer loved it. Rodney Dangerfield was what the industry called a sure thing, a performer so technically precise, so perfectly calibrated that you could set a watch by his laugh rate. But Johnny Carson was not just a host. He was by universal agreement among his colleagues and contemporaries, the finest reader of people in the history of late-night television. He had spent 30 years studying human beings across that desk. He knew the difference between a guest who was on and a guest who was performing. He knew when the mask was load-bearing. And that night in March 1983, something was different about Rodney. Johnny noticed it the moment Rodney walked through the curtain. The timing was slightly off, not enough for the audience to catch. They erupted the instant they saw him, already laughing before he'd said a word. Because that's what you do when Rodney Dangerfield walks into a room. But Johnny caught it, a half-beat of hesitation before the first joke, a flicker behind the eyes that didn't match the grin. He filed it away, kept the show moving, let Rodney do what Rodney did. The first 7 minutes were flawless. 3 tight bits about his wife, 1 about his doctor, 2 about his kids. The audience was in hysterics. Ed McMahon was nearly falling off his chair. Rodney was tugging that collar like a man conducting an orchestra with one hand, pacing the laughs, building and releasing, a master class in comic timing. And then Johnny asked a question he hadn't planned. It wasn't on the card. It wasn't in the pre-interview notes. It just came out the way things come out when you spent 30 years trusting your instincts across a desk. Rodney, Johnny said, leaning forward slightly, voice dropping just a register. You've been making people laugh your whole life, and I mean your whole life. Does it ever get lonely on the other side of that? The audience chuckled, expecting a setup, expecting the collar, expecting the punchline. But Rodney Dangerfield didn't reach for his collar. He went very still. The longest pause in comedy history, 7 seconds. That's how long Rodney Dangerfield sat in silence on live television before he spoke again. 7 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in a comedy set, in any television moment with a live studio audience primed for laughter, 7 seconds is an ice age. The audience shifted, a few nervous chuckles from people who weren't sure if this was the bit. Ed McMahon glanced at Johnny with an expression that said, "What did you just do?" Johnny didn't look away from Rodney, and then Rodney said something nobody in that building was prepared for. "Yeah, Johnny. Yeah, it does. No punchline. No collar, no redemptive laugh at the end. Just that. Plain and simple, and completely devastating." The audience didn't know what to do. A few more uncertain chuckles, then quiet. Real quiet. The kind that settles over a room when everyone simultaneously understands that something has shifted and there's no going back. Johnny Carson spoke carefully. "You want to talk about that?" Rodney looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the audience. Then slowly he nodded. "You know," he began, his voice still carrying the rasp and the rhythm of 60 years in comedy clubs, but quieter now, stripped of its performance armor. "I've been doing this since I was a kid, making people laugh, and for a long time I thought that was enough. I thought if people were laughing everything was fine, everything was good." He paused. "But nobody laughs with you, Johnny. They laugh at you. And when the show's over and everybody goes home." He trailed off. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Johnny Carson, the man famous for his composure, for his unshakable professionalism, for his ability to navigate any moment with grace and wit and perfect timing, that man was leaning forward with his elbows on the desk and his hands pressed together, and an expression on his face that the production crew would talk about for years. He wasn't hosting anymore. He was listening. The joke that wasn't a joke. What came next was not something Rodney Dangerfield had planned. He said so himself years later in one of the few interviews where he spoke about that night. He had come to Johnny's show intending to do his act. 45 minutes of material, some new, some classic. Hit the marks, get the laughs, shake Johnny's hand, go home. That was the plan. But Johnny's question had opened something, some door that Rodney had kept locked for a very long time, and once it was open, the things behind it didn't wait politely to be invited out. "My father left when I was 2, Rodney said. 2 years old. I don't even remember him leaving. I just remember him not being there. And when you grow up like that, when the first lesson you learn is that the people who are supposed to love you don't stick around, you start looking for other ways to make people stay." He looked at Johnny. "I found out pretty early that if I made people laugh, they stayed a little longer. They didn't walk away, so I kept doing it. I just kept doing it." The audience was completely silent. "I built my whole life around a joke," Rodney continued. "The joke is I don't get no respect. Everybody knows that joke. 40 years I've been telling that joke. But here's the thing nobody knows." He paused, and this time his hand did go to his collar, not for a punchline, but as if he needed something to hold on to. "It's not a joke." In the control room, the director later recalled, nobody moved. Nobody spoke into their headsets. The technical director's hand was on the commercial break button, and he never pressed it, because pressing it would have meant interrupting something that felt sacred. Johnny Carson said nothing. He just nodded slowly and let Rodney keep going. She did her best. I know that now. I know that. But as a kid, you don't know that. As a kid, all you know is that you walk into a room and nobody looks up. You say something and nobody listens. You're just there. You're furniture. And eventually you figure out the only way to stop being furniture is to be funny. Because when you're funny, people look at you. They look right at you, and for a minute you exist. His voice was steady but barely. "I spent 60 years existing 1 minute at a time." What Johnny did next. There are moments in television that reveal who a person truly is beneath the professional surface. Moments when the format dissolves, and what you're left with is just 2 human beings in a room together, one of them hurting. Johnny Carson had been in those moments before, with John Wayne, with Dean Martin, with Lucille Ball. Each time he had made the same choice, to be present rather than professional, to be a person rather than a host. He made that choice again now. He stood up from behind his desk. The movement was quiet, deliberate. He walked around to the guest side the way he did for people who needed him. Closer than a desk's length away. And he sat down in the second guest chair, the one usually occupied by whoever was waiting for their segment. He turned it to face Rodney directly. The cameras adjusted. The crew watched. "I want to ask you something," Johnny said. "And I want you to answer it the same way you just answered my last question. Honestly, no bit, no setup." He looked directly at Rodney. "Are you okay, Rodney Dangerfield?" The man who had made 60 million Americans laugh, who had told his pain in the form of punchlines for 6 decades, who had built an empire out of self-deprecation and survival, closed his eyes for a moment. Then he laughed, but it wasn't his usual laugh. It was smaller, quieter, the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely funny because it's genuinely true. "Johnny," he said, That's the first time anyone has ever asked me that in 60 years. That's the first time anybody ever asked me that and actually waited for the answer. The audience heard this, and several of them, later in interviews and in letters sent to NBC, would describe the same sensation, a kind of collective recognition, a feeling of being seen by proxy, because how many of them had also spent their lives performing a version of themselves that was easier for the world to accept? How many of them had hidden something behind a role? Johnny waited. "No," Rodney said finally, simply. "I'm not okay, but I'm better than I was, and I think," he paused, "I think I'm going to be." The childhood he never talked about. Johnny could have steered the conversation back to safer waters. Any professional host would have. A gentle joke, a warm commercial break, back to the bits. The audience would have been grateful for the release, but something about Rodney's stillness told Johnny there was more, something unfinished, something that needed to come out before it could be let go. "Tell me about being a kid," Johnny said, "not the jokes, the actual kid." Rodney looked at him for a long moment. He talked about Kew Gardens and the Depression, about shoes that were too small because there was no money for new ones, about being the kid at school who made everyone laugh because it was the only currency he had, about the father he'd never known, not angry about it anymore, he said, just sad, sad for the younger version of himself who had spent years trying to figure out what he'd done to make someone leave before he was even old enough to speak. "You know what the irony is?" Rodney said. "I built this whole career on not getting respect. And the truth is, I didn't think I deserved any. I genuinely didn't think I deserved it. You don't grow up the way I grew up and come out the other end thinking you're worth much." He shook his head slowly. "You learn to work with that. You take the feeling and you put it in a suit and you make it funny, but it's still there. It doesn't go anywhere." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I was 50 years old before I figured out I was allowed to want more than just the laugh." Johnny was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was carefully level, the voice of a man who was feeling something he didn't want to perform. "Rodney," he said, "you know you just described half the people in this business. You know that, right? The people who went into comedy, into performing, most of them have a version of your story." Rodney looked at him sideways with an expression that was equal parts skepticism and hope. "You think so?" "I know so," Johnny said. "I'm one of them." The audience inhaled because Johnny Carson did not say things like that. Not on camera, not on his own show. The private Carson, the man his colleagues described as emotionally guarded, difficult to reach, a person who could work beside someone for years without ever truly opening up, did not volunteer that kind of information, ever. But something about Rodney's honesty had created a space, and Johnny Carson stepped into it. What Johnny revealed. "I grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska," Johnny said. "Small town. My father was a quiet man, a good man, I think, but not someone who showed you much. You didn't talk about feelings in the house I grew up in. You were always fine. Whatever was happening inside, you were fine." He paused. "And then I got into television, and I found out I was good at something. I was good at being in a room and making it comfortable, making people laugh, making it easy for other people to be themselves in front of a camera." He looked across at Rodney. "And somewhere along the line I realized I had absolutely no idea how to do any of that for myself, in my own life off camera." He smiled, but it was a small, wry thing. Turns out being good at creating warmth for other people, and actually feeling warmth, those are two completely different skills. The studio was so quiet, you could hear the sound system hum. "I've been married 3 times, Rodney," Johnny continued. 3 times, and every single person I was married to would probably tell you the same thing. Johnny was never really there. He was charming, he was funny, he was everything you see on this stage, but he wasn't there. He tapped his chest lightly. "In here. He wasn't available in here." Ed McMahon, who had worked beside Johnny Carson for over 20 years, would later say that hearing Johnny say those words was one of the most shocking experiences of his professional life. Not because they were surprising exactly, he'd suspected as much, but because Johnny was saying them out loud, on camera in front of the country. Rodney was watching him with an expression that was very still and very focused. "So we're both furniture," Rodney said finally. Johnny laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him. "Yeah," he said. "I guess we both learned to be furniture that performs." Something loosened in the room after that. Not completely. The weight of what both men had said was still very much present, hanging in the studio air like smoke after a fire. But something had shifted. 2 men who had spent their entire lives being whatever the room needed them to be, had just in front of millions of people, decided to be themselves instead. And the audience, all 300 people in that studio, felt it in their bones. The thing about respect. Can I ask you something? Rodney said. He'd settled back slightly in his chair, not relaxed exactly, but something closer to comfortable than he'd been since he walked through the curtain. Of course, Johnny said. Do you think it's possible for guys like us to actually feel it? The respect, I don't know, the sense that you're worth something. He wasn't being self-deprecating. He wasn't setting up a punchline. He was asking a genuine question, the way a man asks a question when he's not sure he can handle the answer, but needs it anyway. Or do we just do this forever? Keep performing, keep waiting for the laugh to fill in the empty part. Johnny took his time. The director in the booth would later say he looked at the clock, saw they were 12 minutes over segment, and did not care even slightly. Nobody in that room cared. I think, Johnny said slowly, that the laugh can be real, and the empty part can be real at the same time. I don't think one cancels the other out. He looked at Rodney directly, but I think the mistake, the one you and I have probably both made, is thinking the laugh is going to eventually fill up the empty part, if you just do it long enough. Do it bigger, do it louder, book the bigger venue, get the better slot. He shook his head. It doesn't work that way. Rodney nodded almost imperceptibly. So what does work? He asked. Honestly, Johnny smiled, I'm still figuring that out. But I think it starts with someone asking you how you're doing, and you actually telling them. He paused. The way you just told me. Rodney was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the audience, all those faces watching him, some of them teary. Many of them wearing expressions of recognition, people who had driven their own pain down, under jokes, and practicality and busyness and performance, and recognized in this man something of themselves. You know what's funny? Rodney said. Johnny raised an eyebrow. I've been saying I don't get no respect for 40 years in front of millions of people. And tonight some talk show host finally gives me some. He grabbed his collar. Old habit. But this time he let go immediately. And something in the gesture, the reach and the release felt like watching a man put down a very heavy bag. Go figure. The audience laughed. A full, warm, genuine laugh. Not the kind you force because you're supposed to. The kind that comes from somewhere true. Johnny laughed too. After the cameras, what happened in the 40 minutes after that Tonight Show segment ended, was kept quiet for years. The other guests that night, a singer and a character actor, were told their segments had been shortened. Nobody complained. You don't complain about that kind of night. While the show's final segment ran, Johnny Carson walked Rodney Dangerfield back to the green room himself. Not the stage manager, not a production assistant, Johnny. They sat in that small backstage room while the credits rolled outside, and talked for another half hour, according to crew members who passed the half-open door, and heard the low murmur of their voices. Nobody heard exactly what was said, but people noticed that when Rodney Dangerfield left NBC Studios that night, he was not tugging at his collar. He walked through the parking lot in the cold California air, shoulders slightly less set than usual, and he looked, several crew members independently used the same word, lighter. The Tonight Show received more than 12,000 letters in the week following that broadcast, an unusually high number even for the Tonight Show. They came from every state, from men who said they hadn't cried since their fathers died and didn't understand why they were crying now, from women who said they recognized their husbands in what Rodney described and didn't know how to say so until a comedian said it on television, from people who said they'd spent their whole lives making everyone else comfortable and laughing at their own expense, and had never once heard someone describe that from the outside looking in. Several letters came from comedians, working performers, some of them recognizable names, who wrote to thank Rodney for saying out loud what they had always privately known, that the joke and the wound are sometimes made of the same material. What Rodney said later, Rodney Dangerfield lived until 2. He was 82 years old when he died, still performing in the years before his health declined, still doing the collar. But in interviews in the years after that 1983 Tonight Show appearance, he occasionally referenced that night, not often. He was not a man who made a habit of being earnest in public. But when asked about it, he would say something that reporters found difficult to work into a light entertainment story. He said, "That was the first night I talked to somebody, and they didn't laugh until I said it was okay to laugh. You don't know what that means until it happens to you. I was 61 years old, first time." He also said in a 1991 interview, that was largely overlooked at the time, "I used to think the joke was the truth, dressed up fancy so people could handle it. Now I think maybe the joke is just what you do until you finally trust someone enough to skip the costume. Johnny Carson mentioned the Dangerfield interview only once in public, during a 1987 conversation with a journalist who asked him about memorable Tonight Show moments. He said, "Rodney came in to be funny, and he was. But then he decided to be honest, and honest is harder. Honest is always harder. I respect anyone who chooses hard when they could choose easy." He paused. "Besides," he added, "I think I needed that conversation as much as he did. Why it still matters." Rodney Dangerfield built a career on a single, perfect, portable truth: that the feeling of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated is universal, that everyone has felt invisible, that the joke about not getting respect is funny because it is somewhere underneath every person's secret fear. He turned that fear into an act. He made millions of people laugh at something that had hurt him since childhood, and in doing so, he did something comedians have always done at their best. He made the people in the ring feel less alone. But on one March night in 1983 he went further. He stopped making people laugh at the wound, and let them see the wound itself, without a punchline at the end, without the collar, without the safety net of performance. And in that moment, uncomfortable, unplanned, unrehearsed, Rodney Dangerfield got something he had never quite managed to arrange through 60 years of perfectly crafted comedy. He got real respect. The kind that comes when another person looks at you, really looks at you, and doesn't flinch. Johnny Carson gave him that. On live television, in front of a nation that thought it was tuning in for a laugh, they got something better. If this story moved you, subscribe right now, and share it with someone who has spent too long being the funny one in the room. Someone who makes everyone else comfortable while quietly carrying something heavy. Tell them what Rodney Dangerfield finally understood at 61 years old. You don't have to earn the right to be seen. You just have to let someone look. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. And tell me, have you ever hidden something real behind a joke?